You were never meant to hear this. The files were sealed, the witnesses silenced, and the truth buried beneath centuries of fear, blood, and obedience. But tonight, that silence ends. Imagine this, a candle flickering in a long, shadowed hallway, a staircase that leads nowhere, and a whisper almost human, almost not calling your name from the dark. That was the Grayson family estate in 1832. From the outside, it was just another grand southern manor, draped in Spanish moss and aristocratic pride. But inside, behind walls, 2 bricks thick, and doors bolted from both sides, existed a dynasty that feasted not on wealth, but on power harvested through human despair. The Graysons were not just another elite family, they were the architects of psychological torment, cloaked in religion and tradition. Their doctrine was built on a ritual older than the state of Virginia itself, whispered down from Bavarian cults and stitched into American nobility through secret transatlantic bloodlines. When their youngest son, Elijah Grayson, was born, he never cried. Servants claimed the child had no soul. His mother, Celestine, said he came out with his eyes wide open and a smile like he already knew something terrible. And he did. Because Elijah wasn't born, he was summoned, raised not with lullabies, but with dead languages and black mirrors. Elijah's life was a constant rehearsal for power, not the kind you inherit, but the kind you take from others. He was trained to manipulate thought, emotion, perception. He could make grown men question reality with a stare. When he turned 13, the family held a private ceremony they called a legacy rite. But what truly happened that night was recorded in a burned journal recovered from the ruins of the Grayson crypt. He stood in the circle. The walls bled secrets. The Graysons believed the mind wasn't sacred, it was programmable, like a room that could be remodeled if you knew which memories to burn down first. Tonight, we begin our descent into the macabre. History of the Grayson bloodline, a sinister curse that shaped not just a family, but the very fabric of power in America. The Grayson estate, in 1832, was a place where the air itself seemed to hum with secrets. The house, built on land older than the state, was a labyrinth of locked doors, hidden staircases, and rooms that seemed to shift with the seasons. Servants whispered that the walls had ears, that the mirrors sometimes showed things that weren't there, and that the family's youngest son, Elijah, was not like other children. Elijah Grayson was born during a lunar eclipse, in a room lit only by candles and the trembling hands of his mother, Celestine. He never cried, not once. The midwife, a woman who had delivered half the county, crossed herself and refused to return. "That child has no soul," she muttered, and the servants believed her. Celestine, however, saw something else. She claimed Elijah came into the world with his eyes wide open and a smile that belonged to someone who already knew the ending of every story. From the moment he could walk, Elijah was set apart. He was not raised with lullabies or gentle stories, but with dead languages and black mirrors. His father, Augustus Grayson, believed that power was not inherited, but taken absorbed through ritual, trauma, and the careful manipulation of those around you. Elijah's education was a constant rehearsal for dominance. He learned to read people as easily as he read books, to twist words and emotions, until even the most steadfast servant questioned their own memories. The Graysons' doctrine was built on a ritual older than Virginia itself, whispered down from Bavarian cults and stitched into American nobility through secret transatlantic bloodlines. The family's private chapel was filled not with crosses, but with symbols older than Christianity's snakes, eating their own tails, black suns, and the 7-pointed star of the Mithraic cults. The Graysons believed that the mind was programmable, like a room that could be remodeled if you knew which memories to burn down first. When Elijah turned 13, the family held a private ceremony they called the legacy rite. The details were never spoken of outside the family, But a burned journal recovered from the ruins of the Grayson crypt hinted at what truly happened. Elijah stood in a circle of salt and ash, surrounded by elders cloaked in black. The walls bled secrets, literally, as the family had discovered a way to draw blood from the stone itself, mixing it with well water and sealing it with chants in a language no living person spoke. The ritual was not a rite of passage, but an invocation. The Graysons believed that power was absorbed through trauma, through sacrifice, and through the willing suppression of truth. Elijah was not just being initiated, he was being programmed. The family tested their beliefs on their own staff. Maids went blind overnight. Butlers forgot their children's names. The Graysons buried an infant in a coffin lined with goat skin and rose petals, never recording the name, never blessing the grave. The village, complicit in its silence, collectively agreed to forget. That child, born during a lunar eclipse and drowned in the well by his own blood, was the first fracture in the Grayson lineage. The forbidden histories speak of this child as the seed, the cursed beginning, not just of a bloodline, but of a doctrine. The philosophy of silence through control. The boy's blood mixed with well water and sealed by the chanting of 13 cloaked elders was not a ritual of mourning, but of invocation. From that night forward, Elijah was changed. He could make grown men question reality with a stare. He was trained to manipulate thought, emotion, and perception. The Graysons believed that if you could shatter a person's identity, you could rebuild them into anything. Elijah became the family's first true architect of psychological torment, cloaked in religion and tradition, and the curse that began with him would echo through generations. The Grayson family's power was never just about land or money. It was about the invisible architecture of control, how to fracture a mind, how to bind a will, how to make obedience feel like destiny. The estate itself was a map, not of geography, but of the human soul. Every room, every corridor, every window was designed to manipulate emotion and perception. Augustus Grayson, Elijah's father, was obsessed with the idea that the mind was not sacred, but programmable. He filled the house with mirrors, not for vanity, but for surveillance. He believed that if you could make a person doubt their own reflection, you could make them doubt anything. The dining room, painted in ochre and rust red, was not just a matter of taste. It mirrored the chambers of ancient Mesopotamian death temples, activating ancestral fear responses in the subconscious. Dinner guests left feeling grateful, obedient, unsure why. The Graysons' rituals were rehearsals for world events. Decades before the term behavioral psychology existed, they had mapped human pliability. In the mid-1800s, Henry Grayson, a cousin, brought in a mute orphaned boy who had never seen sunlight. Over 6 years, he was trained to kill without emotion, love without safety, and pray without faith. That boy would later become a high-ranking military strategist in the Spanish-American War. His memoir, never published and locked in the Grayson archives, detailed rituals involving bloodletting, exposure therapy, and sensory deprivation tanks laced with low-frequency sound, all for one purpose: to erase the boundary between self and order. The Graysons believed that if you could shatter a man's identity, you could rebuild him into anything. And they weren't wrong. Every war since 1890 saw a Grayson-connected strategist, psychologist, or diplomat behind it, not always with the same name, but through marriages, front companies, and think tanks. They controlled the chessboard, not by moving pieces, but by redefining what the game meant. The estate's architecture was a living experiment. Guests often spoke of strange feelings, moments of guilt, dread, or unexplained submission as they walked the hallways. It wasn't random, it was by design. The Graysons had mastered the alchemy of control through space, scent, and sound. They understood what governments now spend billions to simulate: how to fracture identity, fracture will, and reassemble it with invisible chains. But the deeper horror lay not in the building, but in the family's secret gatherings, what they called the hollow sermons. These weren't just rituals. They were rehearsals for world events. The Graysons believed that power was not inherited, but absorbed through trauma, through sacrifice, through the willing suppression of truth. The family's doctrine was built on a ritual older than the state of Virginia itself, whispered down from Bavarian cults and stitched into American nobility through secret transatlantic bloodlines. The Graysons were not merely a rich colonial family. They were custodians of a forgotten European priesthood, older than the Catholic Church itself. Whispers traced their roots to the Mithraic cults of Rome, the rites of the Black Sun, and the snake-bound texts locked away in the Vatican books, deemed too dangerous for man to read. These texts claimed that power is not inherited. It is absorbed through trauma, through sacrifice. It's through willing suppression of truth. What the Graysons inherited wasn't just land. It was the knowledge of how to keep people blind willingly. Elijah Grayson, raised in this doctrine, became the family's first true architect of psychological torment. He learned to manipulate thought, emotion, and perception. He could make grown men question reality with a stare. And as the years passed, the curse that began with him would echo through generations, shaping not just a family, but the very fabric of power in America. Beneath the Grayson estate, hidden from the eyes of guests and even most family members, lay the true heart of the curse. 3 subterranean floors, each more secretive and sinister than the last. The lowest level, sealed off after a fire in 1932, was known in family records as the Hall of Instruments. But this was no music room. It was a laboratory of the Minda Theater of Correction. Here, the Graysons collected and built devices decades ahead of their time. Restraint chairs, exposure booths, and sound cannons that produced hallucinations, panic, and compliance. The walls were lined with early psychological devices, some imported from Europe, others invented by the family's own twisted ingenuity. Grayson Oliver II called it the Theater of Correction. It was here that the family's doctrine of control was perfected. Guests of the family, politicians, clergymen, bankers, were sometimes brought below, not for torture, but for revelation. The ritual they called the Mirror Hour forced participants to confront edited footage of themselves, failing under pressure, betraying family, or even simulated child sacrifices. All illusions, constructed through primitive video trickery and psychological manipulation. And yet, they broke. Not one refused the next Grayson invitation. Not one spoke publicly. The Graysons knew that fear isn't power, consented fear is power imposed. By the 1940s, the Graysons began exporting these techniques. They founded schools under philanthropic names, institutes for emotional mastery, and civic harmony centers. But these were not for education, they were for harvesting data. Children were observed like lab rats. One experiment, titled Mirror Reversal, swapped praise and punishment. Children were applauded for lies, punished for honesty. By age 8, they had no moral compass, only allegiance to applause. Broken minds, the Graysons believed, were the perfect citizens, emotionally unstable, externally obedient, and spiritually hollow. This doctrine found its way into national education policy. It's no mistake that modern curricula avoid deep philosophy or emotional resilience. That's not incompetence. It's design. The estate's architecture mirrored this philosophy. The main hall was built to amplify sound, so that whispers carried and secrets were never safe. The dining room's colors and layout were designed to trigger ancestral memories of fear and submission. Even the gardens were laid out in patterns that mimicked ancient Mesopotamian death temples, their paths winding in ways that subtly disoriented visitors. But the Hall of Instruments was the family's masterpiece. Here, the Graysons learned to fracture identity, to break and remake the mind. They understood that the true power was not in wealth or land, but in the ability to shape reality itself. They became the molders of obedience, the architects of silence, the rituals performed, in the Hall of Instruments were not just for the family. They were for the world. Every guest who left the estate carried a piece of the curse with them, a memory, a fear, a doubt that would fester and grow. The Graysons believed that if they could control the minds of the powerful, they could control the world, and for a time, they did. Their influence spread through marriages, business partnerships, and secret societies. Their techniques were adopted by governments, intelligence agencies, and corporations. The Grayson curse became a blueprint for control, a legacy of silence and obedience that would echo through generations. But the price was high. The family itself began to fracture. Some members rebelled, fleeing the estate and changing their names. Others went mad, haunted by the memories and voices of those who had suffered in the Hall of Instruments. The curse was not just a tool, it was a prison, and the Graysons were its first and most faithful captives. By the mid-20th century, the Grayson family's reach extended far beyond the boundaries of their estate. Their doctrine of control had evolved from private rituals to public influence, and their most ambitious project was known only to a handful of insiders as the Obscura Protocol. The Obscura Protocol was a 700-page document, meticulously crafted and fiercely guarded. It outlined how to introduce false myths into national memory, how to rewrite history not by erasing it, but by replacing it. The Graysons understood that the most effective way to control a population was not through violence, but through narrative. If you could shape the stories people told about themselves, you could shape their reality. The protocol detailed media infiltration, textbook revisions, and even archaeological site manipulation. One memo described an ancient stone unearthed in Nevada, covered in symbols older than Samaria. The stone was confiscated by a Grayson-funded security firm, and the Smithsonian labeled it a hoax. No investigation, no questions. The Graysons didn't erase history, they replaced it. If you've ever felt like something doesn't add up in our past, that unease isn't paranoia, it's recognition. Your subconscious knows the floorboards of reality have been swapped. The Graysons' influence was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. They funded university departments to discredit forbidden archaeology, to mock the idea of pre-Diluvian civilizations, to erase the whispers of the old architects who once built cities aligned to the pulse of the Earth's energy lines. During World War II, the Nazis sent entire divisions to map those very lines in Tibet and South America, not for fun, but for power. And who funded those expeditions in secret? A Grayson cousin. Using shell companies so obscure their paper trails disappeared into Swiss vaults. The Graysons' methods were adopted by intelligence agencies, leading to programs like MK Ultra and the creation of blank kings, individuals programmed for obedience. Their techniques became the foundation of modern behavioral science, social engineering, and mass media manipulation. The protocol also described how to neutralize dissent. If someone began to question the official narrative, they were not silenced, were overwhelmed with noise, contradictory stories, endless debates, and manufactured scandals created a fog of confusion. In the end, people stopped asking questions, not because they were afraid, but because they were exhausted. The Graysons' greatest weapon was not money or violence, but silence. They understood that the most effective way to control a population was to make them complicit in their own oppression. If you could convince people to accept the story you told them, they would police themselves. They would silence anyone who tried to remember the truth. But the curse was not just external, it was internal, woven into the very fabric of the Grayson bloodline. Every generation was initiated into the family's secrets, forced to participate in rituals that fractured their minds and bound them to the will of the ancestors. The Graysons were not just victims of a curse, they were its architects and its prisoners. By the 1960s, the family's influence was at its peak. Grayson descendants sat on the boards of major corporations, advised presidents, and shaped public policy. But the price of power was high. The family was haunted by madness, addiction, and suicide. The rituals that had once been a source of strength became a source of torment. And yet, the Graysons endured. Their curse became a blueprint for control, a legacy of silence and obedience that would echo through generations. The Obscura Protocol was their masterpiece, a map of the human soul, a guide to the architecture of reality. But every map has its edges, and every story has its cracks. The Graysons believed they could control the world, but they could not control the consequences of their own actions. The curse they had unleashed would one day turn against them, and the silence they had imposed would be shattered by the truth. The Grayson family's doctrine was never just about their own survival. It was about serving something older, something that predated even the oldest European cults. In the silent halls beneath the Vatican, among documents older than Christ, lies a record of the ardent circular pre-Roman elite cult that wielded psychological control over entire populations, using ritualistic trauma and multi-layered mythos as mind cages. The Graysons were not just inheritors of this tradition, they were its American architects. They understood that a man broken by narrative is easier to lead than a man broken by chains. Religion, for them, was not about salvation, but about programming. The hidden order's obscura manus, the gilded tongue society, knew the true mechanism of control was not domination through violence, but seduction through story, shame, and self-denial. They trained priests, kings, and philosophers not to enlighten, but to pacify. They twisted spiritual hunger into mental servitude. While wars raged above ground, beneath the stone, they passed knowledge, mouth to mouth, ancient neuro-rituals, forbidden symbols, harmonic frequencies designed not to heal, but to fracture consciousness. The Inquisition, the witch trials, the burning of heretics, these were not just about rooting out dissent. They were about erasing memory, purging the last remnants of the old wisdom that threatened the new order. The Graysons, through their bloodline and their doctrine, became the custodians of this ancient machinery. By the 19th century, the Graysons had become more than puppeteers. They were the molders of reality. In 1966, they created the Obscura Protocol, but their true allegiance was to the Ninth Sela Brotherhood of 9 families, who ensured that the soul of the architect, an ancient entity, would be fed through the subconscious obedience of billions. The family crest, long thought to be a falcon, was recently discovered to be a stylized Aja depiction of the pineal gland, with 7 feathers, one for each chakra corrupted during initiation. Every Grayson child was initiated by witnessing death, not natural death, but engineered death, symbolic, ritualized, binding the soul to the family curse. The Graysons' rituals were not just for power, but for continuity. Each patriarch bore the burden of the last, not through reincarnation, but through recursion, a loop, a prison of eternal memory. Imagine waking up in your father's skin, feeling every betrayal, every lie, every moment of weakness, then realizing it's your turn to carry the legacy deeper. The mirror room, deep beneath the chapel, was the site of the final test. There were no mirrors, only a black obelisk made of an unknown reflective material, humming at 17 hertz, the frequency of fear. You didn't see yourself in the obelisk, you saw your predecessor, and he spoke. The Graysons were told this was legacy, but it was possession. The soul was displaced gently over time, through thousands of micro-decisions, guilt, trauma, and pain, until the original personality was overwritten by the accumulated will of the bloodline. This is what they called continuity among elite families, not wealth, not influence, but consciousness. The Graysons were not victims of a curse. They were agents of a much larger system, a system that spanned continents and centuries. From Bavarian blood societies to esoteric Freemasons who believed in the great architect not as God, but as a machine, a builder, a coder. Reality, for the Graysons, wasn't born, it was compiled. The symbols in their manuscripts weren't decorative. They were instructions codes to manipulate emotional fields, to weaken willpower, to bend outcomes by embedding suggestion into ritual. They were the first biohackers, and their product wasn't code. It was obedience. Through trauma, through sacrifice, through narrative, the Grayson curse became a blueprint for the world. And as the 20th century dawned, their influence would only grow, their methods spreading like a virus through every institution that shapes the human mind. By the early 20th century, the Grayson family's experiments had moved beyond the estate's walls. Their doctrine of control was no longer just a private horror, was a template for the world. But the darkest secret of the Grayson bloodline was hidden even deeper, in a vault beneath the mansion, sealed with iron and guarded by oaths written in blood. In 1938, as the world teetered on the edge of war, Charles Grayson led a group of 10 men known only as the Chamber into the Appalachian Spine, following coordinates passed down through centuries of Grayson lineage. Their destination was a vault buried beneath a natural fault line, a place rumored to have swallowed an entire village in 1781. After weeks of excavation, they found a sealed stone gate, carved with a language no scholar could decipher. Charles, starved and bloodied, chanted to it, and it opened. Behind the gate, they found what Charles would later call the neuron engine, a mechanism of living stone and unknown alloys. Humming not with electricity, but with thought, it reacted to intention, mapping the will of those who approached. When Charles touched it, he didn't die. He awoke. From that day forward, he no longer needed to speak to command obedience. He needed only to stand in a room. The Chamber called it the gift of the vault. But others, those who defected or were later hunted, called it possession. Charles began referring to himself in the third person. His eyes no longer blinked. He didn't age. Most disturbingly, he stopped sleeping. From 1938 until his disappearance in 1952, Charles Grayson reportedly never once rested. He walked endlessly through the mansion at night, his footsteps echoing louder than the physics of the house should allow. Those who served him claimed that the walls would cry not with sorrow, but with warning. One maid wrote in her suicide letter, "He looks at you like you're already dead and just haven't realized it yet." The neuron engine wasn't just a relic, it was a transmitter, and Charles wasn't its master. He was its signal. After Charles vanished in 1952, during a thunderstorm so violent it split the estate's foundation, the absence didn't stop the machine, it accelerated it. Leadership passed to his grandson, Elias Grayson, a child of 12 already trained in fractal psychology. The Grayson term for thought branching, a cognitive method where one could hold conflicting realities simultaneously and execute orders with neither emotion nor hesitation. Elias didn't speak publicly until age 19, but when he did, it was before the American Psychological Warfare Board, testifying not as a witness, but as a consultant. The Graysons were no longer hiding, they were integrating. Elias helped design subliminal messaging techniques for televised broadcasts, learned from Charles's old experiments using flicker rates, embedded tones, and pattern dissonance. He authored dozens of anonymous white papers on narrative disintegration, which laid the groundwork for modern misinformation campaigns. But while the world watched Elias as a prodigy, inside the mansion, something older still waited. The neuron engine had been relocated by the CIA under Project Midnight, but what they didn't realize was that what it had opened wasn't just a doorway to knowledge, it had changed the bloodline. Grayson descendants started to display signs of cognitive anomalies, enhanced pattern recognition, eidetic memory, but also sociopathic detachment and emotional dissociation. The family tree was evolving, no longer human in the traditional sense. Elias was the first to call it the ascension spiral, a path where the blood purified itself, not through morality, but through obedience to something non-terrestrial. Government records list over 43 unexplained Disappearances from the Grayson estate between 1954 and 1979. All employees, all documented, none solved. By the time the mansion was raided in 1982, under the guise of a tax audit, the halls were silent. No furniture, no bodies, just the sound of air humming in harmonic intervals. The basement had been sealed with iron, melted shut, and in the center of the dining hall, carved into the wood, was a single phrase: "He is not gone, he is in you." The Grayson curse was no longer just a family secret. It had become a virus in the bloodstream of civilization, a pattern of control and recursion that would echo through every institution, every algorithm, every mind it touched. After the 1982 raid, the Grayson estate was left abandoned, but the true legacy of the family was already loose in the world. The neuron engine, now in the hands of intelligence agencies, became the subject of secret research and whispered rumors. But the Graysons' greatest invention was not a machine, it was a method, a mechanism for manufacturing obedience. Charles Grayson's journals, found hidden beneath floorboards and sealed with children's teeth, described the process in chilling detail. He called it the mechanism. Not books, not scrolls, but anatomical instructions manuals for how to psychologically dismantle a person, how to build loyalty from trauma, identity from obedience, and purpose from terror. These volumes, allegedly older than language itself, were written in a proto-symbolic tongue decoded only through extreme sensory deprivation and ritual fasting. In the hidden chamber beneath the estate, Charles conducted what he called the fracturing. This process split the consciousness of an individual into compartments, each programmed with a role, a memory, a trigger. Victims became instruments unaware of their own programming. If this sounds familiar, it's because echoes of it can be found in modern intelligence programs, MK Ultra, Monarch, Artichoke. The government didn't invent these methods, they inherited them from families like the Graysons. Charles didn't just fracture minds, he rebuilt them. He created what he called blank kings, men in society, with no true identity, only layers of lies and an unshakable loyalty to the shadow doctrine. Some of them became judges, senators, pastors, directors of covert intelligence. The mechanism was working not as an experiment, but as an evolving control system. The Grayson family was no longer operating in the shadows. They were the architects of the darkness itself. The mechanism was exported, refined, and embedded in the very structure of society. It was in the way schools taught children to obey without question, in the way media shaped public opinion, in the way algorithms nudged behavior. The Grayson curse was now a pattern, a virus, a blueprint for control, but the price was high. The family itself was haunted by madness, addiction, and suicide. The rituals that had once been a source of strength became a source of torment. The Graysons were not just victims of a curse, they were its architects and its prisoners. By the late 20th century, the Grayson name had all but vanished from public records. The estate was sold, the family scattered, their influence hidden behind layers of shell companies and false identities. But the mechanism endured. It was in the way people doubted their own memories, in the way they obeyed without understanding why, in the way they accepted the stories they were told. The final horror of the Grayson curse was not in the rituals or the machines, but in the realization that the true prison was the mind. The Graysons had learned to build walls not of stone, but of belief. And those walls, once built, were almost impossible to tear down. If you've ever felt the weight of something invisible pressing on your life, if you sense that your choices aren't really your own, that institutions are shaping your thoughts, then maybe the Graysons weren't unique. Maybe they were a prototype. Maybe you're part of the mass production model. The Grayson curse was never just about a family. It was about the world they helped create, a world where obedience is manufactured, where truth is a commodity, and where the most dangerous prison is the one you can't see. As the 20th century faded into the 21st, The Grayson legacy became harder to trace, but its fingerprints were everywhere. The family's doctrine of control had seeped into the foundations of modern society. Their methods, once confined to the estate's hidden chambers, were now embedded in the very architecture of daily life. The Graysons had always understood that the most effective prison is the one you build in someone's mind. Their rituals of obedience, their fracturing of identity, their manipulation of memory, these became the blueprints for a new kind of power. The architects of the labyrinth were no longer just Graysons by blood, but anyone who learned their methods, anyone who profited from the machinery of compliance. In the 1990s, as the internet began to reshape the world, the Grayson doctrine found new life in algorithms and social networks. The same principles that once governed the estate's rituals now governed the flow of information. Every like, every swipe, every notification was a carefully measured dose of compliance reinforcement. The architects didn't need to control your body, they only needed to shape your attention. The Grayson curse was now a digital virus. It spread through screens and speakers, through headlines and hashtags. It taught people to doubt their own memories, to question their instincts, to accept the stories they were told. The mechanism of obedience had become invisible, but its effects were everywhere, in the way people argued online, in the way they distrusted their neighbors, in the way they surrendered their privacy for the illusion of connection. But the architects were not invincible. Every system has its cracks, every labyrinth its exit. The same technology that spread the Grayson curse also made it possible to share forbidden knowledge, to connect with others who remembered, to question the stories that no longer made sense. Whistleblowers, hackers, and truth seekers began to expose the hidden machinery of control. They traced the patterns back to their source, uncovering the rituals, the experiments, the legacy of the Grayson bloodline. In 2003, a cache of Grayson family documents was leaked online. The files included journals, letters, and diagrams of the family's experiments in psychological manipulation. Their connections to intelligence agencies, their role in shaping public policy. The leak sparked a wave of investigations, lawsuits, and public outrage. For the first time in generations, the Grayson curse was dragged into the light. But exposure was not enough to break the spell. The architects adapted, shifting their methods, hiding behind new names and new technologies. The labyrinth grew more complex, its walls more subtle. The curse endured, not as a family secret, but as a cultural inheritance. For those who remembered, the challenge was clear: to find the cracks, to question the stories, to reclaim the power of memory and choice. The Grayson curse could not be broken by force, only by awareness. The first step out of the labyrinth was realizing it existed. And so, the story of the Grayson bloodline became a warning, a reminder that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, and that the only way to escape is to remember who we were before the architects rewrote our story. The exposure of the Grayson archives in 2003 sent ripples through the corridors of power. Journalists, historians, and conspiracy theorists pored over the documents, piecing together a narrative that was both unbelievable and undeniable. The Grayson name, once whispered only in the shadows, became a symbol of everything hidden beneath the surface of polite society. But the reckoning was not just public, it was personal. Survivors of the Grayson experiments, now adults, scattered across the country, began to come forward. Their stories were eerily similar: fractured memories, unexplained fears, a sense of being watched by something they could not name. Some had become successful professionals, others struggled with addiction and mental illness. All of them carried the scars of the mechanism. Class-action lawsuits were filed against the shell companies and institutions linked to the Grayson family. Some cases were settled quietly, others dragged on for years. The government, eager to distance itself from the legacy of MK Ultra and similar programs, released thousands of pages of redacted documents. But the truth was already out. The Grayson curse was not just a family secret, it was a national wound. In the midst of the chaos, a new generation of Graysons emerged. Some tried to atone for the sins of their ancestors, funding mental health programs and supporting survivors. Others doubled down, using their wealth and influence to silence critics and rewrite the narrative. The family was no longer united by blood, but by the choices each member made in the face of the truth. The reckoning also reached the institutions that had benefited from the Grayson doctrine. Universities, think tanks, and corporations were forced to confront their own complicity. Some rebranded, others issued public apologies, but the stain remained. The mechanism of obedience, once hidden in the shadows, was now a subject of public debate. For those who had suffered, the reckoning was bittersweet. Justice was slow, incomplete, and often unsatisfying. But there was power in telling the story, in naming the curse, in refusing to be silent. Survivors formed support groups, wrote memoirs, and spoke at conferences. They became the architects of their own healing, reclaiming the power that had been stolen from them. The Grayson estate, now a ruin overgrown with vines and moss, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking answers. Some came to mourn, others to rage, a few to forgive. The walls, once thick with secrets, now echoed with the voices of those who refused to forget. And yet, the curse endured. The mechanism of obedience, the architecture of control, the virus of silence, these were not so easily destroyed. The reckoning was a beginning, not an end. The true battle was not against the Graysons, but against the part of ourselves that longs for comfort over truth, for obedience over freedom. The story of the Grayson bloodline is a warning that the greatest danger is not the darkness outside, but the darkness we allow to grow within. The reckoning is not a single moment, but a lifelong struggle, a choice to remember, to question, to resist. The reckoning reached its climax in a courtroom heavy with history and dread. Survivors, now adults, faced the last living Grayson heirs and their enablers. The air was thick with the weight of unsaid words, the silence of generations finally breaking. Judge Harrison, known for his harsh rulings, presided over the trial, his gavel a symbol of a justice system that had too often looked away. The final witness was a young man, quiet and unassuming, who entered the courtroom holding a leather-bound file. His presence was modest, but his eyes, those quiet, storm-filled eyes, held the weight of every child who had suffered in the Grayson estate. He did not begin with accusations. He began with truth. In a calm, factual tone, he recounted the journey of a boy, humiliated, broken, dismissed, a child mocked for being different, for daring to dream. With every word, the courtroom shifted. Even Judge Harrison's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. The young man presented irrefutable evidence, documents, audio recordings, hidden video footage. Every insult, every act of sabotage, every lie that had led the world to see the boy as a criminal, rather than the genius he truly was. The audience, once hostile, sat breathless. Some wept, some shook their heads in shame. The young man paused, looked straight at the judge, and uttered the words, "You mocked me, not realizing I was your superior in law, intelligence, and truth. I am the ghost you buried in your courtroom, and today I rise." Gasps echoed as he revealed his identity, not just a survivor, but the rightful heir to a legal dynasty, sent undercover by the National Council of Legal Ethics. Judge Harrison's face collapsed into horror. The verdict was not just for one case, it was a sentence for an entire corrupt system. As the judge tried to apologize, his words were hollow, trembling. The young man refused to respond. Instead, he walked toward the courtroom exit, flanked by U.S. Marshals, who now recognized him for what he truly was, a warrior of justice in disguise. As he left, The courthouse buzzed with an electric sense of awakening. Reporters cried out for comment, but he said nothing. He walked into the sunlight, where people waited not as a mob, but as followers. The crowd parted as he approached a black car. A tall man stepped out, his mentor, a retired intelligence officer who nodded once. The young man got in, and they drove away. But the story wasn't over. In private, the survivor visited the graves of those who couldn't speak for themselves. He laid flowers at the tombstone of his grandmother, the first one who believed in him. He turned trauma into legal firepower, transforming pain into purpose. The televised speech that followed was not about revenge, but reckoning. "This was never about me," he said. "It was about all of you who were silenced, laughed at, beaten down, told your skin or your story didn't matter. I am you. I promise you, no courtroom in this country will ever again ignore your truth." The screen faded to black, not with credits, but with a single phrase: "Justice doesn't knock, it breaks the door." The ghosts of the Grayson estate, the children who had suffered, the adults who had been broken and rebuilt, were finally given a voice. The curse was not lifted, but it was named. The reckoning was not complete, but it had begun. And somewhere, in the ruins of the Grayson mansion, the walls that had once echoed with silence now whispered a new story, a story of truth, of resistance, of the power to remember and to break the chains of obedience. In the months following the trial, the world seemed to shift. The Grayson name, once a symbol of untouchable power, became a cautionary tale whispered in law schools, government offices, and the corridors of power. The survivors, no longer just victims, became advocates, educators, and leaders in the fight against institutional abuse and psychological manipulation. The media, hungry for every detail, ran exposes on the Grayson legacy. Documentaries, podcasts, and books dissected the family's rituals, the mechanism of obedience, and the hidden history of the neuron engine. The public, shocked and fascinated, demanded reforms. Lawmakers introduced new regulations for transparency and psychological research, stricter oversight of private institutions, and protections for whistleblowers. But the true awakening was quieter, more personal. People began to question the stories they had been told, the systems they had trusted, the memories they had accepted without doubt. Parents talked to their children about the importance of questioning authority. Teachers encouraged students to think critically, to seek truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Therapists helped survivors of trauma reclaim their narratives, to see themselves not as broken, but as resilient. The ruins of the Grayson estate became a site of pilgrimage for those seeking answers, closure, or simply a place to mourn. The memorial garden, planted where the mansion once stood, bloomed with wildflowers and handwritten notes left by visitors. Some came to forgive, others to rage, but all came to remember. The Grayson curse, once a private horror, had become a public reckoning. The mechanism of obedience, the architecture of control, the virus of silence, these were now subjects of open debate. Universities offered courses on the psychology of power, the history of secret societies, and the ethics of memory. Survivors' stories were included in textbooks, their voices finally heard. Yet, the work was far from finished. The architects of the labyrinth had not vanished. They had simply changed their names, their methods, their masks. The mechanism endured, embedded in algorithms, institutions, and the very language of modern life. The challenge was no longer to expose the Graysons, but to recognize the patterns wherever they appeared. For the survivors, the journey was ongoing. Some found peace, others struggled with the scars of the past. But all of them shared a commitment to vigilance, to breaking the cycle of silence, to ensuring that the next generation would not be shaped by invisible hands. Sarah Collins, whose investigation had set the reckoning in motion, continued her work as a journalist and advocate. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and mentored young reporters. Her message was simple: The most important stories are the ones that make us uncomfortable. The ones that force us to look at the darkness, not to be consumed by it, but to understand it and to choose something better. The Grayson bloodline, once a symbol of aristocratic pride and secret power, was now a warning etched into the collective memory. The curse was not broken, but it was named. The labyrinth was not destroyed, but its walls were mapped. And in the quiet spaces between stories, a new kind of freedom began to take root, the freedom to remember, to question, and to refuse the comfort of silence. Years passed, but the shadow of the Grayson bloodline never fully faded. The mansion was gone, the family scattered, but the echoes of their doctrine lingered in the world they helped shape. The mechanism of obedience, the architecture of silence, the virus of control, these were not just relics of a single family, but patterns that repeated themselves in new forms, in new places. Wherever power sought to shape the minds of the many, the survivors of the Grayson legacy became the keepers of memory. They taught their children to question, to resist, to remember. They formed networks of support, advocacy, and education, determined to ensure that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. The memorial garden in the ruins of the estate became a place of gathering, of storytelling, of healing. Each year, on the anniversary of the trial, people came to lay flowers, to read the names of the lost, to promise that the silence would never return. But the curse was not just a story of the past. It was a warning for the present and the future. The architects of the labyrinth had not disappeared. They had simply changed their methods, their symbols, their stories. The mechanism endured, hidden in the algorithms that shaped attention, in the institutions that rewarded obedience, in the narratives that made people doubt their own memories. Sarah Collins, now older and wiser, continued to write, to speak, to teach. She reminded her readers and listeners that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, that the only way to break the curse is to remember who we were before the architects rewrote our story. The Grayson curse, she wrote in her final book, is not just a family secret. It is a mirror held up to the world, a reminder that the price of comfort is often silence, and that the only way to be free is to choose truth, even when it hurts. The last Grayson heir, living under a new name in a distant city, sometimes dreamed of the mansion, of the rituals, of the voices that had shaped his childhood. He wondered if the curse would ever truly end, if the mechanism could ever be dismantled. But he also knew that every act of remembrance, every refusal to obey without question, was a crack in the walls of the labyrinth. And so, the story of the Grayson bloodline became a legend, a warning, a lesson, a call to vigilance. The curse was not broken, but it was named. The labyrinth was not destroyed, but its exits were marked. And in the quiet spaces between stories, a new kind of freedom continued to grow, the freedom to remember, to question, to resist. As the sun set over the memorial garden, the flowers glowed in the fading light, and the names of the lost stood out in sharp relief. The world was not safe, not yet, but it was awake. And that, for now, was enough. Thank you for joining us on this descent into the shadows of the Grayson bloodline. If the story of their sinister curse and the legacy of control unsettled you, subscribe to Unseen Anthology for more true tales where history and horror collide. Share your thoughts or your own family legends in the comments below. And remember, sometimes, the most dangerous curses are the ones we inherit in silence. Until next time, keep your eyes open for what remains unseen, and may the stories you uncover bring you truth, not fear.